It's interesting. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about workers because in general we're all workers. We don't think about the employers that much. And I, reading your book, I thought about the fact I worked for USA Today from 2000 to 2003. They moved into this gleaming, huge structure. And at the time the newspaper was very robust. And then along comes Craigslist and away goes classified advertising and the whole model's disrupted. And now I think of corporate headquarters not as gleaming buildings, but Starbucks, where you see everybody with their computers, like there's a million corporate headquarters in one Starbucks. Talk about businesses, because they're being disrupted as well. How do they adapt?
Well, I think the pace of disruption for businesses across the economy is faster than it's ever been, because digital disruption has gone deep into the physical world. And it used to be that, well, if you were in an information business, then maybe your business model would be threatened. If you were in publishing, if you were in the news business, the video entertainment business, music. But now healthcare, energy, education, transportation, accommodation, sort of corporate real estate, all of them are being disrupted. And so I think the way companies are dealing with it, there are a number of strategies that they're following. Many companies are setting up corporate venture capital arms to try and invest in the companies that might disrupt them. And that's sort of a hedge. They say, well, maybe if we get a piece of the company that's gonna steal our business, then that's a transition plan. I see many companies trying to bring the platform idea into the company. So Heineken, for example, which realized a few years ago that they were being disrupted by the microbrew business and by online sort of beer sales, said, well, we can't become a microbrewery because that sort of is antithetical to the idea of being Heineken and being this macro brewery. So instead they set up a platform called Beerwolf, where they're lending their distribution and customer access capabilities to hundreds, thousands of microbrews around the world who are now operating under the Beerwolf platform. And so this is Heineken saying, well, let me embrace the platform model and try and make it work for me. There are many companies that have embraced the on-demand labor model. They've said, well, we'll redesign our software within the company to try and make it seamless between putting an on-demand person and a full-time employee on a corporate team. But for a company, it's not as easy as just sort of whipping out an app and pressing a button and hiring someone. That's okay if you're hiring someone to clean your apartment or to do some remodeling or to paint your fence. But for a company, you need to integrate them into a complex sort of organizational workflow. And so I'm seeing companies like the New York Times, like Walmart, trying to, like Nokia, trying to bring in this on-demand and this platform idea into their companies. But I think fundamentally, when you're really successful, under one particular business model, it's hard to be completely prepared for the disruption.
For someone like yourself who's studied these things and obviously you're a professor as well, we've seen these marks in society. You're out with your donkey and your plow, and suddenly there's technology. You have your product from the West Coast, you want to ship it to the East Coast, you put it on a train, then suddenly it's not on a train, it's on a plane, it gets there a lot quicker. We see all of these kind of advances. And whenever there's an advance, people are left on the wayside, and there's new jobs created, but there's always the fear factor. What would you say to the people who look at the sharing economy and say, I can't make heads or tails out of it, I wanted to go work at a company for 30 years, get my gold watch, it's a whole new world. What do you say to them? Because there is kind of a trepidation out there on the part of some.
You're absolutely right that we've always seen technological change cause a change, in the world of work. I mean, at the turn of the 20th century, 41% of Americans were farmers or involved in farming in some way. Close to half of them were self-employed. By 1960, 90% of the workforce was a full-time employee. By 2000, only 2% of Americans were involved in farming. So over the course of 100 years, we saw the prior wave of technological change dramatically sort of alter the landscape of work. But I think, what some people are feeling sort of this angst about, in a sense, is that the world of work in the United States in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was really good. There were strong labor unions. There was high-paying work for people who did not have a college degree. And I don't think that that's coming back. And so it's less about the arrangement and more about, there was this golden period in American sort of work history that is now over, and things are going to change faster and be tougher in some sense in the years that follow. And so looking back and saying, well, I wish I could work 30 years and pick up my gold watch, the response, the unkind response is, hey, that was just a phase. And you sort of dial back 100 years and read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, and you see just how bad full-time employment could have been. And it's really about looking forward and saying, embrace the idea that transition is a stable state, that the world of work is going to change a little faster in your lifetime than it did for your parents or grandparents. But if you're prepared, if you're educated to deal with change, if your mindset is one where change is a good thing, then you're going to actually be able to sort of realize opportunities that your parents or grandparents couldn't. Because the reality is that while we sort of we reminisce about the stability of work and the golden years of full-time employment. At that time, most people weren't very happy in their work. Work was repetitive. Work did not foster creativity. There wasn't a lot of mobility. Today, the opportunities are endless, and so change can be a good thing. As I said, I'm a glass half full kind of guy.
In 2008, Brian Chesky started peer-to-peer room and home rental company Airbnb with his two friends. While the pandemic has significantly impacted the travel industry, Chesky says his company is focused on reconnecting with meaningful travel in the coming year.
You mentioned Brian Chesky in your introduction. You have a quote from him starting off the book. I mean, if you pick up this book, you open it up, the stuff that matters in life is no longer stuff, it's other people, it's relationships, it's experience. It's a whole nother way of rethinking business too, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think the asset-based model of commerce, where we bought stuff, which drove a lot of the second half of the 20th century, is on its way out, and the 21st century will be about experiences, will be about getting the service that you need, or getting the impression that you need, getting the experience that you need, rather than having to acquire the stuff. And so, I also think that another lesson that anybody who's in high school or college can learn from the Airbnb founders is this notion of living in a world of your own design. And Brian Chesky's feeling was always, I want to design the world that I live in, because if I don't design it right, then someone else will come and design it for me, and I won't like the world that I end up with. I often think about this in the context of Facebook and the world that they've designed, that we've let them design for us, and the fact that perhaps we should have been more proactive about designing the world that we want to live in, because these digital platforms are going to shape the world that exists. They are the most important digital institutions of the 21st century. And so we have to think very carefully about design. And as an individual college student, I think someone has to be thinking about, how do I want to design my career?
We've talked about a number of different countries. They've all got their own little kind of niche markets, but it seems as though China's really embraced the sharing economy, perhaps more than any other country. Why is that?
You're absolutely right. China's sharing economy is probably bigger than the sharing economy of the rest of the world put together. And I think it had to do with a number of factors. One was that China sort of leapfrogged the PC era and went straight to smartphones. The first really country scale internet came through the mobile device. And so they were sort of smartphone natives rather than having to transition from PCs. And the sharing economy is largely a smartphone-driven phenomenon, and so they were quicker to embrace. I also think it has to do with the fact that consumers are younger in a sense, not age-wise, but they haven't been through 2 or 3 generations of being a consumer society. In the typical American, their parents owned a car, their grandparents probably owned a car. So thinking about not owning a car and taking an Uber everywhere requires a much bigger mindset shift than the typical Chinese consumer, who is more likely than not the first middle class or upper middle class consumer in their family. And so they're much more willing to embrace a new consumption model as the gateway to the middle class. I also think it has to do with the emergence of more tightly integrated payment systems. Again, China leapfrogged the credit cards and went straight to WeChat Pay and Alipay. And having that payment system and everything embedded into the WeChat application can make the sort of physical world consumption far more seamless and feels safer. And so these are 3 of the reasons why I think China has embraced the sharing economy more actively. I also think that in the Chinese mindset, although they have aggressively embraced the capitalism model over this generation, the idea of shared consumption comes more naturally than in a country like the United States, where the culture is much more about the individual. I mean, China was historically a farming culture, an agricultural society. And in agricultural societies, sharing and community become a much bigger part of life. The United States has always emphasized the individual, the lone ranger, sort of the rancher culture. And so the idea of sharing becomes less sort of natural, in the public consciousness.
A recent survey of 500 global educators found that most are embracing new models and approaches to education. Only a fraction, 5%, want to return to the status quo of pre-COVID-19 classrooms. Almost 70% of educators would like a blend of the traditional classroom and virtual tools.
It's so interesting because as we walk through these halls, I have to think, are the students more equipped for this future, or are the professors like yourself more equipped in terms of teaching them about the future?
When I think about the future of education and I think about how platforms and the sharing economy are going to affect it, the company that comes to mind to me always is a Chinese company called VIP Kid. And they are connecting almost 100,000 teachers in the United States with hundreds of thousands, probably 1 million by now, kids in China who want to learn English as a second language. And they've got this really sophisticated artificial intelligence technology that is optimizing exactly how the experience is for the student, even though the teacher could be in Odessa, Texas, and the student is in Beijing, China. But somehow in a 25-minute lesson, they're lowering the cultural gap enough that this teacher can actually educate the student through a platform. The more global education becomes, I think, the more well-rounded the students will be, because each of these 1 million kids in China is also getting an important cultural experience for 25 minutes, as are the 100,000 teachers. And so, we may not have to send students abroad for them to get that global view. They can just get it through the platform because they've got a different professor from a different country in every class that they take.
People-to-people exchanges.
Yeah.
Technology is often blamed for substantial job losses and increasing income and wealth inequality. As a result, places like Europe and the US have seen a rise in far-right populism rooted in economic unrest. But recent research suggests a lack of innovation and entrepreneurship are actually at the root of this problem.
We talked a little bit about income inequality. Maybe you can chat about that a bit, and also benefits in the social safety net. I mean, it has to be restructured in a sense too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think that we have seen rising income and wealth inequality. But I have always felt that we need a new currency for inequality, because a lot of technological change doesn't change the income or wealth gaps, but can change the quality of life gaps. The fraction of the world's population that has access to their own telephone has grown dramatically in the last 30 years. So access to communication device inequality has gone down. 30 years ago, a small fraction of the population had a television. Today, a lot of people have streaming video entertainment. It's the same thing with access to transportation, access to good healthcare. And so we should be cautious about reading too much into the rise of income and wealth inequality. And we should instead step back and say, how is quality of life, access to the things that people want, how are we doing on that measure of inequality? Because if we stop the technological progress that is leading to improvements in everybody's lives, because we feel somehow it's contributing to income inequality, we may end up hurting everybody. But I do think a genuine concern for people who are in their 40s or 50s and are seeing their work, their occupation being disrupted, is of transition and is of the social safety net. Full-time employment over the 20th century constructed around itself in some ways, the benefits and the protections, stability of income, healthcare, the ability to retire and still have an income, the ability to get the right kind of insurance in the workplace, all of these things that people value. Many countries, including the United States, built a particular way of providing that to people that was inextricably tied to full-time employment. And now that we're moving into a world where a lot of people will not be full-time employees, we're struggling to figure out how do we reattach these benefits to these other work arrangements. And to me, it's always been a funding question. We settled into a world where the employer would fund these things. Right? I mean, you got paid a certain salary, but then the employer was spending additional money. And in some ways, you get paid less than you otherwise would because you cost, 30% more because of your benefits. Now, when we move into a world of freelance work, we have to figure out who's going to fund this. How are we going to arrange for the platform, for the individual, and for the government to work in tandem to make sure that these things that everybody aspires to, like the things that provide stability, the ability to plan, the ability to feel safe, are available widely to everybody. And so that's one problem that we're certainly going to face, reconstructing our social safety net. Another problem is in successfully transitioning the people whose work is being platformized or being disrupted by progress in the AI and the blockchain and the other technologies that you mentioned. I think that's one of the biggest public policy challenges of the next 20 years, because I believe that in the United States and in the UK in the 80s and 90s, we did not manage that manufacturing transition well. We did not create a transition plan for people whose jobs were either being automated or being sent to other countries. And the political backlash that we're seeing in both of the countries today is a direct consequence of not having managed this transition. Now, the scale of transition in the next 20 years is going to be an order of magnitude bigger, not just in the US and the UK and Western Europe, but in China as well. At its peak, America had 22 million manufacturing workers. Today, China has 80 million manufacturing workers, a lot of whose jobs are going to be automated. And so thinking about transition, thinking about creating the equivalent of a college degree, but that is designed for someone who is mid-career, has a family, has a mortgage, and thinking about that package, that bundle of not just skills, but other things that people might need to transition with dignity, to be able to find the career that works for them next. I think that's of paramount importance for every government around the world.
It'll be a fascinating story to watch, correct?
It absolutely will be, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.